383.
What is this? 43?
51.
Are we 51?
Yeah. We were 50 last week, so I'm assuming you were 51.
We are. That's what it says on my computer. 51.
Jeez.
Where you been? Haven't you been?
I don't know. I was, something came up in the computer. So that's been a moment.
Okay. So
Lesson.
we mentioned last week the saying of the Kotzker Rebbe,
Lesson.
who was a Hasidic Rebbe in the 1800s, in the late 1800s. He said, "There's nothing more complete than a broken heart." Right? We mentioned that last week, and it would seem odd. It seems strange. You would think that what's complete is a complete heart, and what's broken is a broken heart, and not the opposite, right? So, I don't know how many of you are familiar or well-versed in the history of Hasidus and the Baal Shem Tov, but the Baal Shem Tov championed a approach and an outlook of Ahavat Yisrael, love of a fellow Jew. You would think Jews always did that. What did he change? Like, it's a verse in the Torah. What was he changing that like became the Baal, like Hasidus? It's in the Torah, yeah? So during that time, this is going back around 300 years, it was not too long after the pogroms of in Ukraine of Khmelnytsky, and about 50 years after the episode with Shabtai Tzvi, familiar? A false Messiah, who he claimed to be the Messiah and ended up converting to Islam, and it was a real blow to the Jewish people. And during that time, because of all the pogroms and because of all the most of the big cities, Jews weren't allowed to live in. Most of the government, like the in Petersburg, the big centers, Jews were not, unless you were a part of the government, unless you were vital to the government, Jews were not allowed to live there. And so what happened was, for financial reasons, many Jews started getting into agriculture. And in order to be in agriculture, you have to live in places where there aren't a lot of people, right? Because you have to have you have fields and land. So if your livelihood is from agriculture, you don't live in a dense population, right? So what happened was, there were a lot of Jews that stopped going to school to yeshiva every day. And even more than that, they started living in places where there weren't a lot of scholars. And what slowly started to happen was that there became a big divide in the Jewish people between those who knew and those who didn't. And it became so great that those who knew would look down, would look like those who didn't know, had no connection, would look down at them. And those who didn't know really didn't know. They didn't know many of them didn't know how to read, didn't know basic tenets about Judaism. They knew they were Jewish. They tried to live as Jewish a life as they could, but they didn't know much. Now, you always have those that want to influence others, that want to. So there would be what was called Magidim. A Magid is a preacher. Preachers that would go around and try to awaken the hearts of those of the simple people. That's what they were called. Amei Haaretz. Am Haaretz is the nation of the land, right? Like people of the land. People of the land traditionally were not smart. We're not learned. So what would happen? A preacher would come to town and try to awaken the hearts of those who didn't know. How would you do that? How do you do that? No, well, stories, but harsh stories. Today it's known as Musar, but the Musar movement of today is fairly new. But then it was Musar. Musar means rebuke. They would sit and chastise the people. Do you know what type of hell is waiting for you? Do you know how disappointed God is when you don't make proper blessings, or you don't do this, or you don't do that, and scare people into doing the right thing? And this was the custom that people would go around and literally scare communities into trying to become better. They didn't know really how. There wasn't really much they could do about it. They did whatever they could. But they felt this was their connection to Judaism. So they invited this. They invited people to come and make them cry. It was considered like a good thing to get someone to come to town, someone that was learned, that would teach them a thing or two. And everyone knew you'd come to shul, you'd walk out a devastated person, but at least you were devastated because you weren't close to God. Yeah, this was normal. The problem was it wasn't really changing anything, because they weren't sticking around and teaching the people what to do. They weren't. When someone threatens you with something, so in the moment you get excited to do the right thing because you're so scared, and then a minute later, or a day later, or a week later, you need the next dose, right? Yeah, you go to the dentist, you brush your teeth for a few days, and then 6 months later, another few days, right? So the Baal Shem Tov came and changed the whole thing on its head. Although the Baal Shem Tov was the fourth Baal Shem, there were three that came before him that started this tradition. The Baal Shem Tov was the first that came out into the open. And the group that the Baal Shem Tov led was known as the group of the hidden ones. There were many tzaddikim, many righteous people, many great Torah scholars that chose to lead this path in life, and they would disguise themselves as simple people. In other words, they'd walk around with looking like the regular peddler, farmer, blue collar, the regular guy who's working a hard job. They would mingle with the simple people, but they would try to influence them slowly. So whenever someone would ask them how they're doing, they would say Baruch Hashem. They teach the people how to say Baruch Hashem, right? Bless Hashem. Blessing Hashem, this is a big thing. They would slowly tell them stories of the righteous to try to warm them up, warm their hearts to come closer. And they would go to a city and they would stay there sometimes for years, teaching the people, bringing in teachers. And many times they would secretly pick one or two people in the town and give them a full injection of everything. Literally teach them Torah, turn them into scholars on their own rights, and then they would leave and go to the next town. This is literally around Europe. They'd go from town to town. They had a group, let's say 50, 60 rabbis. They'd go to 50, 60 towns. They'd stay there for 4 years, convert the town into a town that wants to learn more. They'd hire teachers to come and settle in the town, and they'd leave a few people behind that would continue to inspire the town, and they'd move on to the next town. But they all did this in secret. No one knew about this. No, there was no until one day the Baal Shem Tov, after being the fourth leader of this type of group, Baal Shem Tov sort of came out into the open and started teaching this idea of love of which primarily rested on the fact of love of a fellow Jew, because the Baal Shem Tov taught about God, and therefore about the significance of a Jew, because he has an neshama, and therefore he's a part of God, just like the biggest scholar. There is no difference between the simple Jew and the big scholar. They're both an equal part of God. So now the Baal Shem Tov turned the whole Jewish world on its head. The separation that was created between the elite, those who know and those who didn't, was the Baal Shem Tov was trying to blur that gap and blur that separation. And many people many of the opponents of Hasidus believed that the Baal Shem Tov was an ignoramus, because for most of his life, that's who he mingled with. The Maggid of Mezrich, who was his disciple and his successor, everyone knew was a world-class Torah scholar, because the Maggid wasn't always a Chassid. The Maggid started out as a regular person. He was a world-class Torah scholar. So everyone believed that the Baal Shem Tov was an ignoramus. The Maggid, he was the scholar. And then the Maggid had to convince them that however smart he was, the Baal Shem Tov was a much greater Torah scholar than he was. But at the time, this is what people felt. So if you go out into the world and you ask someone who knows a little bit about Chassidus, they'll contrast it to Musar. Musar is where you you chastise someone, you berate someone. Chassidus is where you build them up you build them up. You build up their self-esteem almost through love, through someone. Someone gave this to me. He called it Musar. I'll just read what it says. This is the type of thing you would hear from a Musar in the Musar, although probably much worse than this. This is a rabbi said this from the 18th century. When I get to heaven, they'll ask me, why didn't you learn more Torah? And I'll tell them that I wasn't bright enough. Then they'll ask me, why didn't you do more kind deeds for others? And I'll tell them I was physically weak. Then they'll ask me, why didn't you give more charity? And I'll tell them that I didn't have enough money for that. And then they'll ask me, if you were so stupid, weak, and poor, why were you so arrogant? And for that, I won't have an answer. Yeah? This is the type of thing you'll hear. Someone wants to put you in your place. Who do you think you are? You think you're this great guy? You're nothing. Yeah, that's like Chassidus doesn't do that. Chassidus doesn't do that.
We saw a thing, they had a documentary where these Jewish families, remember, they would travel to small towns and find Jews in those small towns and try to get them together. And then they move on. But they didn't scare them. They were really loving and kindness, and they were trying to show them how to be a Jew in the small towns where there were no synagogue.
Today, no one does the other path. Today it's a different. But the Baal Shem Tov brought this awareness to the world, and till the 60s and 70s, Chabad, Chassidim, but really Chabad was the only one that championed this path. Today everyone does, because everyone sees it's the only successful way of doing it. But up until then, the Rebbe had a lot of opposition. People were very upset when the Rebbe took tefillin to the streets, and when the Rebbe put on tefillin, the Rebbe encouraged Chassidim to put on tefillin with Jews who were non-religious. The religious world was up in arms about it, because tefillin, you want to know why?
Yeah.
Because why don't we educate kids in every mitzvah, right? Why don't we educate kids in tefillin?
I didn't know we didn't.
Huh? It's a mitzvah. Kids don't put on tefillin until they're bar mitzvah. Right. Some people do it a few weeks before just to get them ready. But from when they're 0 years old, we bring them to shul to hear the shofar. Why don't we put on tefillin when they're 8, 9? We make sure they eat in the sukkah. Why don't we make sure they put on tefillin? And women also. Women, even though they're not commanded in most of the...
They can?
1 minute. Even though they're not commanded in most of the mitzvahs that are time-bound, for example, shofar, a woman isn't obligated to hear the shofar, but I've never met a woman that doesn't try to hear the shofar. Even though women aren't obligated to shake the lulav, I've never met a woman that hasn't tried to shake the lulav. And if a woman wants to do any mitzvah, they're allowed to, even if they're not commanded to. There's one we don't, and that is tefillin. Why not? Because tefillin needs to have a clean body, physically and a clean mind, but even physically a clean body. So a person, it speaks a lot in the Code of Jewish Law about making sure to empty your body before you put on tefillin. Even to release gas while wearing tefillin isn't appropriate. So if a person is gassy, they shouldn't put on tefillin. They should wait until it passes. My great-grandfather used to carry pills in his tefillin bag, and if in the morning he would take one to make sure he was people, but it's a real thing, and therefore and that's why today we don't wear tefillin all day. It used to be people that would study, they would wear tefillin all day. Rabbis would wear. If you worked, you didn't, but if you studied, you'd wear tefillin all day. We don't, because we are not as in control of our bodies as they used to be. Physically, also mentally. Our mind goes many places. You don't want to be thinking about work while you're wearing tefillin. So a man has to wear tefillin because they're commanded to. We don't have a choice. So we try to control ourselves as much as possible. And when we fail, we know we have to grow, but we don't have a way out. But because a woman isn't obligated to, by her putting on tefillin, even though she would be doing a mitzvah, she's also putting herself in a position that any little negative thought is violating the tefillin. And because she doesn't have to wear them, why would you put yourself in a position that you're going to be going right, that you're not going to be doing it properly? And the same thing with a kid. A kid isn't responsible enough to be in control of themselves. Bar mitzvahs. So why did I don't know how I got here.
about women.
No.
No?
Why did I?
Oh, the Chabad movement of going outside.
Oh, about tefillin.
Yeah.
So the people had a problem. You're going into the street. You're asking someone who may not be dressed properly, definitely didn't wash his hands in the morning, right? You wash your hands in the morning before you say a bracha. Didn't wash his hands. You don't know what's going on, and how could you be sure that you're putting on tefillin that it's kosher? You know, and this was just the first of a list of complaints they had. Today, no one voices those complaints. The Rebbe addressed all these complaints. Look in the Rebbe's talks. The Rebbe addresses for a year. The Rebbe was busy publicly answering all the accusations and all the claims, all the complaints against them for years. And different campaigns that Rebbe made. This was a big deal. Why did I give this whole introduction? Huh? I wasn't planning on it, and I don't know how far we'll get inside, but it's very important to understand the anomaly and sort of the out of place almost content that we will see in the next 3 chapters. In the next 3 chapters, we are going to learn chapters that are not going to be as uplifting as the last 28 were, or may not seem that way. They are going to sound more like Musar. They are going to train you how to berate yourself, how to break yourself, how to make you feel less than. And the question is, how does this fit with Chassidus? The whole point of Chassidus, the whole point the Baal Shem Tov championed was not to break, right? The verse that says, when you see the donkey of your enemy struggling under its load, you know the verse yeah? So you will think that I should let him go, help him, yeah? So how did the Baal Shem Tov translate that verse? He said, when you'll see a donkey, how do you say donkey in Hebrew? Chamor. Take the cholam from the mem and put it at the ches, and you got chomer. What's chomer mean? Material. So the Baal Shem Tov says, when you see material, and you see material, any type of material, even your body's material, and you think sonacha, you think that it's your enemy, because anytime I try to do a mitzvah, anytime I try to connect to God, my body gets in the way, materialism gets in the way. So you would think, stop helping it, stop feeding it. Fast, break yourself, make sure the body doesn't get in the way. That's not the right way. You got to help it. You got to turn, just like we're learning about the animal soul. You would think the animal soul, you got to break it and get rid of it. No, we have to transform it. We have to try to use it to help us in the service. This is what the Baal Shem Tov championed. And here the Alter Rebbe is going to teach us how to break ourselves, how to break the body. How does this fit with Chassidus? So apparently, sometimes we do need a little beating. Why would we need a little beating? So as we discussed, we learned in chapter 19, we're going to learn a little later also that the person is like a candle. What makes a candle a candle?
Flame.
Well, yeah, but then it's a flame, then it's not a candle.
Yeah, the wax.
Oh, so you got the candle, you got the physical candle, you got the wax in the wick, and then you got the flame. A candle without a flame is not a candle, and a flame without a candle is not a candle. Well, it's a potential candle. Right? Each one is potential, but you just got a flame. You light a flame, a lighter. As soon as you let go, the flame goes away. Right? You got to attach it to something. So the same thing is a person. Person has a body, which is the candle, and then you've got the neshama, which is the flame. Right? Ner Hashem, Nishmas Adam, the candle of God is the neshama of man. The neshama is the flame, and that's why you can have a person. Yeah, a person that's not alive, the body's there, but he's not alive. The neshama isn't there. You can have a neshama. The neshama existed before the person came around. Yeah, but if it's just a neshama, it's not a person either. It's got to be attached to a body. So a healthy person should have a body that wants to serve the neshama, and the neshama that wants to be connected to the body. The problem is most of us are not healthy in that way. The Beinoni is not healthy in that way. The Beinoni, the body wants to go in one direction, the neshama wants to go in a different direction. Right? The body doesn't want, is sort of fighting the urges of the neshama. So what do you do if the body and the neshama, if the candle and the flame are not the flame is not attaching itself to the candle? What do you do? How do you know if the candle, if your flame is attached to the candle or not? How could you tell? By looking at yourself if the flame is attached to the candle.
Were we talking about the flame like when we talk about the sparks of Hashem?
Yeah.
Okay.
So who's in charge? When I look at myself, who's in charge? My mind or my heart? If my mind's in charge, which soul primarily rests in the mind? We learned in chapter 9, the godly soul. So if my mind's in charge, then I know my godly soul has caught on to my body. If my heart's in charge, I know my godly soul hasn't really found its place, hasn't really caught on. Yeah? Anywhere, if my faith in Hashem is obvious, then I know who am I? Who's the boss? Who's shining? The godly soul. If it's like this, then it might not be the godly soul. So if you look at your own life, you can sort of tell who's in charge. Did the godly soul, did the flame catch on to the body or not? Now, what happens if you have a candle and the flame doesn't catch on? There could be many reasons why a flame does. Let's take a piece of wood. You're trying to light. This happens every year here in Lag Bomer. We try to light the fire. Yeah. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
Usually, what makes it difficult for the fire to catch on to a log? If it's wet, or there's another way. If it's too big. If it's too big, then the flame doesn't catch on. So what do you have to do?
Yeah, you do the kindling. You get the small branches to catch first.
That's a roundabout way. How do you get the log? You have a log, and the log won't catch. How do you get the log to catch on? You break it into smaller pieces.
Okay.
This is what the
kindling.
it's kindling. It's the same thing, but it's breaking the log itself.
But breaking it down. So this is the analogy here for the chapter.
Exactly. So if the candle, the godly soul is not catching on to the body, you got to break the body. This is from the Zohar. Alter Rebbe is going to quote a Zohar, and Alter Rebbe is going to tell us the next couple chapters when it's necessary to employ this tactic, when we have to deal with it, when we have to stoop down almost to break the body, and how to do it. He's going to teach us how to do it. Now, truth be told, in today's day and age, I believe, I have to look again, but I believe one of the Rebbes said that although we learn this, we have to learn, we have to know it, and we have to employ it sometimes. Usually the other parts of Tanya will be easier for us to implement in a way that will uplift us and give us what we need. But it's important to know what happens if we're so stuck, if we're so thick and big that nothing catches on. And what it's called, what happens. So let's look here. Let's start inside and we'll read a little inside and see where we go. Page 383, chapter 29. Those whose souls are of the level of Beinanim must seek means of contending with yet another difficulty. So remember, we're in the last 3 chapters we've discussed how to serve God with joy. The way to do that is by making sure there's no negative emotions or thoughts getting in the way. So we dealt with most negative emotions. Now the Rebbe is going to bring us to one last thing, right? Ach od achas, one more thing that a Beinani has to contend with. Yet another difficulty. What's the difficulty? Occasionally, and even frequently, they experience a dullness of the heart, as though it had turned to stone. And try as they might, they cannot open their heart in prayer, which is by definition the service of the heart. So we learned, Alter Rebbe taught us that a Beinani is in control of his mind. And if a Beinani is in control of his mind should produce a healthy heart. And yet sometimes you could study. And when it comes to feelings, nothing. You could try as hard as you could to fix the relationship with someone else and use your brain to remind you how much you love them and how much they mean to you and how much better they are than you. And when it comes to feelings, it doesn't move. And this is called Timtum Halev. The heart is plugged. the passageway from the mind to the heart is plugged up, stuffed up. So usually there's supposed to be a passage that brings from the mind into the heart, and here there's a blockage. What do you do when there's a blockage? You got to plunge it, right? You got to get it out.
You get an operation.
You got an operation, exactly. Also, so that's one problem, one part of the problem. Also, the heaviness in his heart, in other words, even if the mind manages to penetrate into the heart, and there is no blockage in the passage, but the heaviness in his heart prevents him at times from waging war against the evil impulse, in sanctifying himself in permitted matters. In other words, his heart is in the right place, but it's just too heavy. It's too weighed down to get involved. It can't be bothered. What do you do? So in this case, the advice given in the Holy Zohar is, as the president of the Academy of Gan Eden. That's what the Rosh Yeshiva in the heaven, in Gan Eden. That's how the Zohar phrases this. Said, what was the advice he gave? A wooden beam which does not catch fire should be splintered. This is the metaphor. Similarly, a body into which the light of the soul does not penetrate should be crushed. And thereby the body becomes receptive to the soul's light, as the Zohar concludes. Yeah. So why are you splintering the body or the beam of wood? Not because you have something against it, not because you want to get rid of it, but because you want the fire to catch on. The only way to catch it on, for the fire to catch on, is if it's crushed. Now, the reference to the light of the soul, which in this case does not penetrate the body, means that the light of the soul and of the intellect does not illuminate to such an extent as to prevail over the coarseness of the body. In other words, it's possible that the light doesn't enter the body, like if he has timtum alev, it's stuffed up, but it's also possible that it does go in, it just doesn't have an effect because the body is so heavy and so coarse. Thus, although he understands and meditates in his mind on the greatness of God, his mind is perfect. His mind is meditating on the right thing. It understands the right things. Yet that which he understands is not apprehended and implanted in his mind to the point where it enables him to prevail over the coarseness of the heart because of the degree of in other words, the mind and the heart's coarseness and crassness. Now, the Alter Rebbe here is talking to a Beinoni who's in control of his mind. And therefore, what's the problem? His heart. But really, if you're not a Beinoni yet, you might have a problem with your mind too. In other words, whereas you're supposed to spend hours meditating on God and doing the meditations that would normally translate into feelings, we may not even be able to meditate that long. We may have a problem with the stuffness of that our minds might be stuffed as well. Okay? And for that, there's other solutions or further solutions. But here the Alter Rebbe is talking specifically to someone who primarily what's at fault, what the thing at fault here, or what the problem lies specifically in the heart, not in the body, in the materialism, because the heart represents the animal soul that resides primarily in the heart, right? So the body and the animal soul in this way are sort of synonymous. Why? How does a person's heart get so coarse and crass that it can't develop a love to Hashem, can't develop an attraction to holiness? The cause of this deficiency is the arrogance of the klipa of the animal soul, which exalts itself above the holiness of the light of the divine soul, so that it obscures and darkens its light. So the problem is that the animal soul is it's like it's putting up a blockage in front of the light. So what do? How do you get rid of a blockage? Therefore, one must crush it and cast it down to the ground. Just as in the previous quoted analogy, the beam is splintered so that it will catch fire. How do you do this? How do you splinter the body? How do you crush the body? This means that one must crush the sitra achra and cast it to the ground by setting aside appointed times for humbling oneself and considering himself despicable and contemptible, as it is written. What is written? Now, a broken heart leads to a broken spirit. The spirit being the Sitra Achra, which in the case of the Beinanim, is the very man himself. Okay, we'll get to. Before we get to that line, so there are three ways really that a person can break himself, can crush himself. One is, there are three ways that a person can be broken. One is from God. Yeah, a person can live his life and think everything's great, he's the best around, and then God sends him even one test or one thing, and he's totally broken. Yeah, he's the CEO of the biggest company. One day God sends a blow, he's fired and he's disgraced and he ends up in prison. That's a blow from God. Well, although he probably did something to cause himself to go there, but the blow wasn't something that he created, right? The crushing came from. Then there could be crushing that comes from someone else. Thank God, although you're an arrogant, who knows what, you have a good friend, and the good friend realizes that this arrogance isn't going to get you anywhere, and he puts you into your place. And one day you realize he's right, so you get crushed from it. Again, someone else. But we'd much rather, if we had to be crushed, we'd much rather do it ourselves. So the Alter Rebbe is teaching us here how to break yourself in a way that's not dangerous. In other words, it's not going to break you to the point that you're going to break your godly soul too. In other words, that you're going to lose hope and that you're not going to do anything. You have to break yourself in the sense that you're breaking the parts that need to be broken, so that the light of the godly soul can catch on and turn you into a godly person. Yeah, that's the point here. There's a story that Rebbe once said about the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab had an older brother. For many years, the Rebbe Rashab refused to take over after his father passed away. He refused to take over the leadership because he had an older brother. And he didn't want to become the Rebbe if he had an older brother, but the older brother didn't feel he was a Rebbe. So for 10 years, the Rebbe Rashab was like the unofficial Rebbe. His older brother didn't do anything that the Rebbes do. The Rebbe Rashab did, but he never officially, he didn't start sitting in his father's place, in the Rebbe's place, where in the shul or whatever. So the Rebbe Rashab once, a chassid came to him and asked him, needed a blessing in something, needed help. And the Rebbe gave him the one answer that every chassid dreads hearing, every person dreads hearing. What answer does any person dread hearing when they need a favor? I can't help you. Chassid heard this, he left, he went out of the Rebbe's room and he broke down crying. He couldn't control himself. So the Rebbe's older brother comes by, the Razah. All the Rebbeim and their children and families were known by their acronyms. So the Rebbe Rashab was Reb Shalom Ber. The Razah was Reb Zalman Aaron. So the Rebbe Rashab's older brother sees him crying. So he asks him what happens. He told him, came to the Rebbe for a blessing, and the Rebbe said he can't help him. So the Razah goes into his younger brother to the Rebbe's room and he says, I don't understand, you're the Rebbe. A Yid comes to you, a Jew comes to you for help, and you say you can't help him? This guy is crying uncontrollably. When the Rebbe heard that, he said, call the chassid back in. The chassid came in and he gave him a blessing and he was helped. So when the Rebbe repeated the story, the Rebbe asked, what's going on over here? Why did if the Rebbe Rashab could have helped him, why did he tell him he can't? So the Rebbe explained it using this part of Tanya. The Rebbe said that the Rebbe Rashab saw this chassid and he saw that he was not refined enough and he was not capable of receiving God's blessing. He needed to be broken. He needed to be humbled. To humble enough to receive God. Right? God says he can't live with someone who's haughty. God says I can't live with him under the same roof. Why? Because by definition, someone who's haughty doesn't leave space for others. God fills up the whole world. So if the person who's haughty doesn't leave space for others, God says I can't be there. He's pushing me out. So in order to be a receptacle, in order to receive God's blessings, you have to be humble. This chassid needed a lesson in humility. Once the Rebbe heard that he broke down and he was humbled, now he was capable of receiving the blessing. This is how the Rebbe explained. And this is really what the Alter Rebbe is telling us here, that in order for you to receive the fire of the godly soul, the person sometimes has to be crushed, has to be humbled. Now, the question is, here it says, we just read, that you have to humble. Now, a broken heart leads to a broken spirit. What are you breaking? The spirit of the Sitra Achara. Yeah. So why do you have to break yourself? Why should you break yourself? Break the sitra achra. In other words, instead of saying you're such a bad person because you sinned, say the sin is such a bad thing. Klipa is such a bad thing. Why are you berating yourself? You're your godly soul. Yeah, you could be your godly soul. Why are you berating yourself? So Alter Rebbe is telling us in the next few words over here that every person has their own self-identity. The question is, how do you identify? Do you identify with your godly soul or with your animal soul? So the Rebbe is soon going to bring a story that Hillel would say before he go to eat. He say he's going to do a favor he's going to do his body a favor. He's going to eat. Who did he identify with? Who was when he said I? Who is I? The godly soul.
Oh, got it.
He said, I'm going to do my body a favor to feed him. In other words, I am the godly soul. My body needs to live, so I'm doing him a favor. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it, of living. Yeah. So when are you more likely to feel like you're doing someone a favor? When you're going to eat or when you're coming to a Torah class? When you're going to eat, you don't feel like you're doing someone a favor. You enjoy eating. You're not doing someone a favor. When you come to class, you're doing someone a favor. Either your rabbi or your parents, even if they're not around, you're giving them nachas, or even yourself. You might be feeling, I really should learn some Torah. I really should do that, but almost like I'm doing myself a favor. You don't approach, not always. Obviously, there are times we do a mitzvah and we don't feel like we're doing anyone a favor. We feel like we're doing ourselves. But many times we feel like when it comes to physical things, we don't feel like we're doing ourselves a favor. Maybe when you go to the doctor and you don't really want to go, you feel like you're doing yourself a favor, yeah? But when you're doing something pleasurable and enjoyable, you don't feel like you're doing yourself a favor, right? So here we can decide, so who am I? Am I the godly soul or the animal soul? Jay mentioned before, you look in davening, sometimes it sounds like we're talking to ourselves as the godly soul and we have an animal soul. Sometimes we're talking, what do we say in the first blessing in the morning after, the third blessing, after the blessing of Modani. So Modani is not the blessing. It's something we say before we wash our hands, but really what's the blessing of Modani? Elokai neshama shenasata b'tahori, right? So after we wash our hands, we say Al Natilat Yadayim. Then we say Asher Yatzar, right? The God created us. That's a blessing we say after we come out of the restroom. Then the next blessing is the Modani with God's name. And basically we say, God, the neshama that you gave it, that you put into me is pure, right? We studied this in the... Right. So who am I and who's the neshama that God put into me? It says, God, the neshama you put into me is pure. In other words, I am the body, I am the animal soul. The neshama you placed into me is the godly soul. Yeah? So who do I self-identify with? Am I the godly soul or the animal soul? Depends on the person. Yeah. Sometimes you can have a person, tzaddik, who identifies with the godly soul. He is the godly soul. Then you can have a Beinani, a struggler who identifies with his animal soul. That's why it says that a tzaddik, even when he dies, is alive. And the Zohar says not only is he alive, he's even more alive than when he's alive.
Does it have an animal soul?
Oh, in other words, what's a tzaddik's life? What's his identity? His godly soul. The godly soul wasn't created when he was born and doesn't end when he dies. So for a tzaddik, if you say a tzaddik, his life is the godly soul, it never dies. How could it be more alive after he dies? Because during his physical lifetime, even though his life is the godly soul, but still he has a body to contend with. He has to spend time to feed it, to make it sleep. After he passes, he doesn't have a body holding back his godly soul. So in a way, the tzaddik is more alive after he dies. Now, for us, it's more difficult. It's harder to relate. But if you go to a tzaddik, and that's why people go to the graves of tzaddikim, because if you go to a tzaddik because they're a tzaddik, then you're not going to their body, you're going to their soul. And after they're passing, their soul is even more alive technically than during their lifetime. The same thing it says on Russia. A Russia, even during his lifetime, is dead. Why? Because in the minute you're born, your body's dying. So if your life is your body and your body is in the process of dying, in other words, getting weaker every day, so the Russia, even when he's alive, is really dead. In other words, but a Bainani, it might seem like his life is the godly soul because he does everything right? But beneath it, the Bainani really has the soul of is the personality of a Russia. In other words, he has the animal soul that's just as strong, and many times he can identify with the animal soul, even if he doesn't feel it all the time because he's busy dominating and studying. So let's look here what the Alter Rebbe says. So in the middle of the paragraph, let's start this paragraph, this section again from the second paragraph here on 386. This means that one must crush the sitra achra and cast it to the ground by setting aside appointed times for humbling oneself and considering himself despicable and contemptible, as it is written. Now, a broken heart leads to a broken spirit. The spirit being the sitra achra, which, in the case of Beinanim, is the very man himself. Because remember, the Beinani identifies with his body and his animal soul. So if you identify with the body and the animal soul, and the body and the animal soul come from klipa, klipas noga, but klipa. So in other words, you are klipa. For in his heart, the vital soul, which animates the body, in other words, the animal soul, is in its full strength as it was at birth. Hence, it is indeed the very man himself. And with regard, so what's the godly soul? If I am the animal soul, what's the godly soul? With regard to the divine soul within him, it is said, the soul which you gave within me is pure. In other words, within me cannot be understood as referring to the body alone. The body cannot speak for itself as a complete man. Thus, it must refer to the animating soul. Therefore, the words which you gave within me imply that the man himself, who is saying these words, is not identified with the pure soul. Right? He's identified with the animal soul. In other words, the divine soul is a thing apart, which has been placed within this me. What's the me? The body and the animal soul. So this is by every person, except in the case of tzaddikim. With them, the contrary is true. The man himself is the pure soul, in other words, the divine soul, while their body is called the flesh of man. And as the flesh of man means the man is not the flesh. The man is the soul. The flesh of man is the secondary to the man himself, the divine soul.
So
Yeah.
that, okay, so then, if that's the case, God starts you each day with a pure soul.
Yeah.
You screw it up all day long. Then God's going to take it back and clean it and do all that. So with the tzaddikim, he doesn't have to do any cleaning
Cleaning, no. Doesn't have to clean it.
because it's as pure as it was when he gave it to him.
Yeah, but it still goes there, maybe for much less time, and it goes for other tune-ups, for other things. It gets better, it gets whatever God does, but it doesn't need cleaning in the same way. No. The Alter Rebbe had a colleague, Reb Nachum of Chernobyl. Till today, I think there's a Hasidic dynasty of Chernobyl. He was a colleague of the Alter Rebbe, and he was very, very heavy, very big. And the Alter Rebbe said that he became fat, he became big from saying Amen Yehi Shmei Rabba. You know, in Kaddish we say Amen and then Amen Yehi Shmei Rabba Mavarach.
Yeah.
So he would say it, and it would give him such pleasure that his physical body, just like you get pleasure from food, you eat food and you get pleasure, and the body expands. Because his life was his godly soul, his physical body expanded because of the spiritual pleasure he was having. That's a tzaddik, because a tzaddik's life. So for us, because our life is our physical bodies, so what do we need to feed our bodies? Food. For a tzaddik whose life is spirituality, what does he need to feed his body? Spirituality. Of course, the spirituality needs to be enclosed. He needs food too, but maybe perhaps not as much. His spiritual life is potent enough and fatty enough and real enough for him. It's real enough. It could actually feed him.
Yeah, but you can't even be a tzaddik if you don't take care of your body.
Right.
In other words, you will be,
and that's why Hillel.
is going to be dead.
So let's read it. So Hillel didn't not eat, but he was doing his body a favor. It was in this sense, in the middle of 387, it was in this sense that Hillel the elder would say to his disciples when he went to eat, that he was going to do a favor to the lowly and pure and poor creature, meaning his body. He regarded his body as a foreign thing, and therefore used this expression, that he was doing it a favor by giving it food. For he himself was nothing other than the divine soul. It alone animated his body and flesh. Inasmuch as in Tzaddikim, the evil that was in the vital soul pervading their blood and flesh has been transformed into good. Right? Like we said, ishapcha, they transform their animal soul into a godly soul. And what animates the blood? What flows through the body? The animal soul. But now by a tzaddik, the animal soul is a second godly soul. So what's animating their blood? Godliness. So it has been transformed into good and completely absorbed into the holiness of the divine soul. And thus the divine soul is the man himself. I identify with my divine soul. With a Beinoni, however, since the substance and essence of the vitalizing animal soul, which stems from the Sitra Achra, which pervades his blood and flesh, has not been transformed into good, it indeed constitutes the man himself. And therefore, by crushing his own spirit, the Beinoni actually crushes the Sitra Achra. So if you identify with the godly soul and someone crushes you, they've just crushed the godly soul.
Oh,
Because you identify with the godly soul. But if you identify with the animal soul and someone crushes you, they've done you a favor. They've crushed the Sitra Achra, the Klipa. The question is, how do you know what the person identifies with? And therefore, before you say something negative to another person, you better think 50 times. Because if that person, if when you talk to that person, you're talking to their godly soul, and you say something out of place, you're now fighting against God. And that's why the mitzvah of love your fellow as yourself is so important. That's why it's going to be chapter 32 within this thing. Because if our bodies are primary, it's not possible to love someone else. But if our souls are primary, then it's not possible not to love someone else. Because if your soul is the main thing, if you identify with your soul, then you assume the other person identifies with his soul too. Now you're one. You're not even brothers, you're twins. Because the soul is a part of God. We're going to discuss this in chapter 32. But if you have an issue, if a person struggles with anger, lashing out at their kids, at their spouse, at their friends, at people, this is a good place to start with. To think, who am I talking to? Who am I berating? Who am I offending? Am I offending another body, or am I offending a piece of God? That's quite something to think about before we say something negative to someone else. And even a child that needs discipline, and you need to discipline them. What am I disciplining? You may discipline a child very differently than you'll discipline a part of God. So if you look at a child as a part of God, you're going to have to discipline them because God gave you the responsibility, but how are you going to do it? Is it going to sting the same way? Are you going to say it with the same irritation? Are you going to say it with the same frustration? Are you going to use the same words? Or are you going to pick less pointed words? How are you going to do it? Depends who you're talking to.
So somebody, maybe I'm all right on this, somebody can't become a tzaddik. You are born a tzaddik. God decides you're a tzaddik. It's not something you can decide, I'm going to become a
Correct.
tzaddik.
Usually, yes.
But isn't it also that when you're talking to someone and there is, you want to, like you say, rebuke them or something, but you should give them the benefit of the doubt because, like you say, you never know if you're talking to the godly soul or the animal soul. And if you give them the benefit of the doubt, then maybe you're approaching it a better way. Like you say, shave off that harshness and speak to them in a different, like maybe sometimes even a roundabout way to get across it.
That's for sure. But you don't even need the judge. In other words, judging them favorably means you're questioning whether you need to rebuke them at all. Right? When does someone need rebuke? When they do something that they should be doing differently or could be doing differently, right? And they're not. Judging them favorably means that you're assuming that they couldn't do it any other. You're judging them favorably. But let's say even if you judge them favorably, they still need rebuke. And it's your responsibility to rebuke them. If you see someone doing something dangerous and you don't stop them, even if legally you're not held responsible, morally you are. If someone's on a bridge, ready to jump off, are you responsible to stop? Are you responsible to try to stop them?
Not legally.
Not legally.
But morally.
Legally, you're not responsible. Legally, there was a case in Florida where kids saw someone drowning in the water and videoed it and were laughing at it. They can't be tried. They didn't call 911 and do anything. You can't do a thing. Morally, that's vile.
I mean, as long as they weren't endangering themselves.
They were videoing. They should have called 911. Of
If
course.
They couldn't swim or.
Of course.
But definitely.
But you get someone else to come. We don't have those laws where you see something, you have to get involved. On the contrary, if you do get involved, you can get sued if you're not trained properly. So people
That's
are
why
scared.
a lot of doctors will not stop to help in an accident because in certain states you could be sued if that person then dies.
Yeah, the problem is that if a doctor, if they find out that the doctor passed and didn't stop, they could be sued for not stopping.
Okay.
Because the doctor takes an oath. A doctor may have an obligation to stop, whereas a regular person doesn't have an obligation to stop. But the point here is that if you look at someone else and you realize we're not talking about someone else here, we're talking about ourselves. I was just taking that to its obvious conclusion. Really, here we're talking about ourselves. How do I identify myself? Am I the godly soul? If I'm the godly soul, then the way I look at everything material in the world, the way I look at myself, at my body, is as something separate, as something God gave me to take care of. Okay, I have to take care of it, but I am taking care of it. I am not it. I'm taking care of it. Whereas for the average person, even the Beinoni identifies with the body and the animal soul. And therefore, it may need to process the body and the animal soul to let the godly soul catch fire. Because it identifies with the body, sometimes you have to break it if the fire isn't catching on. So if the body is something else and the fire isn't catching on, breaking it isn't the problem because it's not you. But if you're the problem, if you're the log, if you identify with the log and the log's not catching on, we got to break you. And that's how the Alter is going to continue with meditations, how to break yourself from the inside in a way that's helpful. We'll pause here.
There's no way person is a Beinoni. If you can become a Beinoni, you're doing good. You can't become a tzaddik. But